The fluorescent lights in Westbridge Private Hospital hummed softly as Anna Monroe strode down the pristine white halls, her rubber-soled shoes making almost no sound against the polished floor. The hospital had been her second home for 2 years, a place where she had learned to balance compassion with professionalism, where she had comforted the sick, held the hands of the dying, and fought tirelessly to save lives. But today, something felt different. There was a strange, heavy weight settling in her chest, an unease that she couldn't shake. It had started that morning when a nurse from the administrative office had handed her a sealed note. "Dr. Harris would like to see you in his office." Immediately, the words had sent a ripple of anxiety through her. In her experience, unexpected summons from Dr. Stephen Harris, the head of neurology, were never casual. He was a man of precision, his time valuable, his demeanor always stern. He did not summon people without reason. Had she done something wrong? Had there been a complaint? The past few weeks had been exhausting, shifts blending into one another, sleepless nights, emotionally draining cases. But she had never faltered, never neglected her duties. Still, the human mind had a way of spiraling into worst-case scenarios. Was she being transferred to another ward? Suspended? Taking a deep breath, she stood outside his office, her fingers tightening into a fist before she forced them to relax. The door in front of her was a deep mahogany, polished to perfection, like everything in Westbridge Private. Expensive, pristine, untouchable. She exhaled slowly, squared her shoulders, and knocked. "Come in." His voice was firm but not unkind. Anna stepped inside, immediately greeted by the faint scent of antiseptic and expensive leather. The office was large, the city skyline stretching out behind the doctor like a breathtaking painting. Dr. Harris stood near the window, hands clasped behind his back, his sharp eyes fixed on the horizon. He didn't turn to face her immediately, and that only made her pulse quicken. "You wanted to see me, doctor?" she asked, careful to keep her voice steady. Finally, he turned. His expression was unreadable, but something about the way he studied her made her stomach tighten. Measured, serious, weighing something in his mind. "Anna," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I have a patient who requires special care, but this job is not for the weak-hearted." A flicker of confusion crossed her face. Not for the weak-hearted. She had seen more pain, suffering, and loss than most people faced in a lifetime. She had held hands of patients in their final moments, had fought to save those who couldn't be saved. If that didn't prove strength, what did? "What kind of patient?" she asked cautiously. Dr. Harris didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to his immaculate desk, where a thick medical file lay waiting. He turned it toward her, his fingers pressing down on the manila cover. Grant Carter. The name made her breath catch. Grant Carter. The Grant Carter. She didn't need to read the file to know who he was. The name had once dominated headlines, plastered across business magazines and newspapers alike. The youngest billionaire in the city. A ruthless businessman. A man who had built an empire at just 32 years old. And now he was a ghost trapped in his own body. The black and white newspaper clipping attached to the file told her everything she already knew. The horrific car crash that had nearly killed him 1 year ago. His sports car had veered off a bridge in the middle of the night, leaving him in a coma ever since. A powerful man, now powerless. A man who once controlled everything, now at the mercy of fate. His family rarely visits, Dr. Harris continued, his voice even. Most of the medical staff simply do their rounds out of obligation. But Grant Carter needs someone dedicated, someone who will actually care. She stared at the file, suddenly aware of the weight of this moment. A comatose billionaire. A man the world had forgotten. A patient who might never wake up. The room felt smaller, the silence stretching between them. She could walk away. She could say no. There was no shame in declining a case like this, in choosing a patient who could actually speak back to her, who could acknowledge her efforts. But deep down, she already knew her answer before she even spoke. She lifted her gaze, meeting Dr. Harris's eyes with quiet determination. "I'll do it." For a brief second, his expression softened. A subtle nod. "Good," he said. "Your shift starts tonight." Anna's fingers rested lightly on the thick file in front of her, but she made no move to open it. The weight of Grant Carter's name alone was enough to make her hesitate. She had heard the stories, seen the headlines. A self-made billionaire, a man both feared and admired, known for his ruthlessness in the business world. But the man described in those articles, the one who had built an empire from the ground up, no longer existed. Dr. Harris exhaled, folding his arms as he studied her reaction. I won't sugarcoat it, Anna. This will be one of the most difficult assignments you've ever taken on. She finally lifted the file, flipping it open. A black and white photograph of a mangled sports car took up half the page, a grainy newspaper clipping pinned beside it. Below, the medical reports, pages upon pages detailing the extent of his injuries. Severe head trauma, multiple fractures, internal bleeding. A miracle he even survived. But survival didn't mean living. Not anymore. She skimmed the details, her throat tightening. 1 year. That was how long he'd been trapped in this state. A man once brimming with power, now reduced to nothing but a fragile body kept alive by machines. Dr. Harris continued, his tone careful. His condition is stable, but his chances of regaining consciousness remain uncertain. We've maintained his care, of course, but he hesitated before finishing. Not everyone on staff feels a personal investment in his recovery. Anna looked up, frowning. You mean they don't care? He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. They care in the sense that they do their jobs. They ensure he is fed, his vitals monitored, his body maintained. But there's a difference between keeping someone alive and actually treating them like a person. She understood what he meant. Over the years, she had seen it before. Patients left alone, their humanity slowly fading in the absence of real human connection. No visitors, no conversations, just sterile rooms and the beeping of machines. She glanced at the last page of the file, where notes on family visits were kept. The section was almost blank. They don't come, she asked quietly. Dr. Harris shook his head. His younger brother, Nathan, makes an appearance every few months, but it's mostly to ask about legal matters. The rest of his family, he let out a humorless chuckle. They've moved on. There's no one waiting at his bedside, hoping he'll wake up. Anna's fingers tightened around the edge of the file. A man with unimaginable wealth and power, yet completely alone in the world. She swallowed the lump in her throat. And you think I'll be different? Dr. Harris nodded. I do. She let out a slow breath, processing his words. It wasn't just about caring for a patient. It was about being there when no one else would be. About treating him as more than just a case number, more than just a body on life support. It was daunting, terrifying even, but then she imagined him, lying in that hospital bed, his body trapped in stillness, his mind lost in a place no one could reach. She imagined what it must feel like to be forgotten, and she knew she couldn't let that happen. Lifting her gaze, she met Dr. Harris's eyes, her decision already made. All right, she said, her voice steady. I'll take the case. A flicker of approval passed over his face, though he kept his expression measured. Your shift starts tonight. Anna nodded, and as she walked out his office, file in hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the start of something bigger than she could possibly understand. Anna adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder as she stepped out of the elevator onto the top floor of Westbridge Private Hospital. She had worked here for years, had walked these halls more times than she could count, but this was different. The air was quieter here, thick with something unspoken. Unlike the sterile, uniformed patient rooms on the lower floors, this level had been designed for a different kind of clientele. The elite, the powerful, the ones who demanded more than just medical care. They required discretion, privacy, perfection. Everything was flawless. The polished, dark oak floors gleamed under the dim glow of the overhead chandeliers. The walls were lined with expensive paintings, the kind that made you feel like you were in a luxury hotel rather than a hospital. Even the faint scent in the air was different. Not just antiseptic, but something richer like fresh linen and understated wealth. She exhaled, forcing herself forward. Room 709. Grant Carter's room. Her fingers hesitated for the briefest moment before pushing open the door. The first thing that struck her was the silence. The second was him. Grant Carter lay motionless in the center of the large, expensively furnished suite, surrounded by machines that hummed softly, their rhythmic beeping the only indication that life still lingered within him. The room itself was warm, spacious, with sleek dark furniture, tall windows draped in heavy curtains, and a private balcony overlooking the city, a contrast to the cold, lifeless figure on the bed. Her breath hitched as her gaze settled on him. She had read his file, had seen pictures of him from before, the billionaire tycoon, the ruthless CEO who had commanded boardrooms with a single glance. But nothing could have prepared her for this. Even in stillness, he was striking. A strong jawline, high cheekbones, dark lashes resting against pale, unmoving skin. His broad shoulders were visible beneath the hospital gown, his once powerful body now thinned from months of immobility. But it wasn't his appearance that unsettled her. It was the absence of presence. He looked like a man simply sleeping, but there was something else, something deeper. As if you're trapped somewhere far away, just beyond reach. Her chest tightened. She stepped closer, her movements careful, almost reverent. She had cared for comatose patients before, but something about this felt different, more intimate, more important. Forcing herself to focus, she reached for the warm cloth prepared for his evening care. Her fingers trembled slightly, though she had no reason to be nervous. This was just another patient, another shift, another human body that needed tending to. But as she dipped the cloth into the basin of warm water, squeezed out the excess, and gently pressed it against his arm, a strange chill ran through her spine. It was sudden, an unexplainable sensation, like the briefest whisper of energy passing between them. Like he knew she was there. Her breath hitched, her fingers stilled for just a second, hovering over his skin. Then beep. The heart monitor let out a small, steady pulse. She exhaled, shaking off the absurd thought. Coincidence. Just a machine doing its job. She forced herself to continue, her hands moving methodically, her focus shifting back to the task at hand. As she worked, she spoke. Not because she expected an answer, but because the silence felt too heavy, too suffocating. "You don't get a say in this, huh?" she murmured, her voice soft. No response. "I'll take that as a no." Still nothing. A small smile tugged at the corner of her lips, despite herself. She didn't know why, but it already felt like he was listening. Anna's days fell into a rhythm, a routine, a pattern, a quiet familiarity that stretched from one shift to the next. Each evening, she stepped into Grant Carter's silent world, a world that existed in the soft hum of machines and the steady beeping of the heart monitor. A world where his body remained still, yet something beneath the surface made her wonder if he was truly lost in the darkness or simply waiting. At first, her care was purely clinical, bathing him, ensuring his sheets were fresh, adjusting his 4 lines, monitoring his vitals. It was the work she had done countless times before with other patients. Efficient, detached, necessary, but somewhere along the way, it became more. It started with small things, a habit of speaking aloud as she worked, filling the silence with the sound of her own voice. At first, she told herself it was just to break the eerie quiet. That was all. "You should see the cafeteria food, Grant. It's tragic, really. Even for a billionaire, I doubt you'd survive it." Silence. She sighed, dipping the warm cloth into the basin, wringing it out before running it over his arm. "I don't even know why I'm talking to you," she murmured. "Maybe I just like the sound of my own voice." Still nothing. A pause. Then the soft, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. She smirked. "Or maybe you're actually listening." The sound of the machine filled the room. Steady, unchanging. But the idea stuck. And over time, it became natural. She talked to him about everything. Her day, the patients who frustrated her, the rude doctor on the 3rd floor who stole her coffee. She told him about her childhood, how she had grown up in a small town where everyone knew each other's business, where summers were spent barefoot by the lake, where her mother's cooking was terrible but full of love. She teased him, half expecting a smirk to tug at the corner of his lips. "I read somewhere that people in comas can still hear things," she said one night, wiping the damp cloth along his jawline. "So technically, you're the worst listener I've ever met." No response, of course. She sighed dramatically. It's okay. I'm used to talking to myself now. But then something shifted. She began to notice things. Little things. Like the way the heart monitor seemed to beep just a little differently whenever she spoke. Like the way she felt something when she touched him. A fleeting sensation, as if some part of him was reaching for her in the dark. It was irrational, ridiculous even, but she couldn't shake the feeling. So she kept talking. And maybe, just maybe, he was listening. Anna had grown accustomed to the stillness. She had spent weeks watching over Grant Carter, tending to his care, speaking to him as though he might one day answer. She had memorized every detail of his face, the sharp angles of his jaw, the way his dark lashes rested against his pale skin, the faint crease in his brow that had remained, even in unconsciousness, as if his body was still holding on to something. She didn't expect anything to change, until one night when it did. She was adjusting his pillow, her hand brushing against his cheek as she carefully wiped along the curve of his jawline. It was a simple movement, part of the routine she had performed countless times before. But then, a flicker of movement, a twitch, so slight, so brief, that for a moment she wasn't sure if it had even happened. She froze, eyes locked on his hand, waiting. Nothing. Her breath left her in a quiet rush. Maybe she was imagining things. Maybe it was just the exhaustion, playing tricks on her mind. But the next evening, it happened again. This time, she wasn't looking directly at him when she felt it. The faintest pressure against her wrist, like a whisper of touch, so delicate that if she hadn't been holding his hand at that exact moment, she would have missed it completely. Her pulse hammered. "Grant," she whispered, barely aware that she had said his name. The silence pressed against her, heavy, unchanging. But she wasn't imagining it. She knew she wasn't. The next morning, she found herself standing in Dr. Harris's office, hands gripping the edges of the chair as she tried to explain. "He moved," she said, her voice firm. "Twice. First his fingers twitched, then I felt him press against my wrist." Dr. Harris leaned back, his expression measured. "Anna, I know what you're going to say." She cut in, her heart racing. That it could be a reflex, that it might not mean anything. But it wasn't just once. It happened again. I felt it. Dr. Harris was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he sighed, rubbing his temple. "We'll run tests. But don't get your hopes up too high." She nodded, but deep down, she already knew the truth. Something was happening. And when the test results came back, they proved she was right. "There's increased brain activity," Dr. Harris told her, flipping through the report, his voice laced with something just shy of surprise. "His neurological responses are stronger than before." Anna's heart leaped. "So he's waking up," she said, her breath catching. Dr. Harris hesitated. "Not necessarily, but it's a good sign." It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was enough, because for the first time in a year, there was hope. The evening felt like any other. The hospital had settled into its familiar quiet, the kind that came when night stretched over the city, muffling the usual daytime chaos. The hallways outside were still, save for the occasional murmur of nurses at the station, the soft hum of medical machines, the rhythmic beeping of heart monitors in the distance. Inside room 709, Anna moved through the motions of her routine, her hands working with practiced ease as she cared for the man who had become more than just a patient. She had stopped expecting miracles. Even after the test results had shown increased brain activity, even after she had seen those small, fleeting movements, she had forced herself to be realistic. Hope was a dangerous thing in a place like this. She dipped the warm cloth into the basin beside her, squeezed out the excess water, and gently ran it over his wrist, her fingers brushing against the coolness of his skin. And then it happened. A sudden pressure. Faint, weak, but unmistakably real. His fingers tightened around her hand. Anna froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't like before. This wasn't just a twitch, a reflexive movement with no meaning. This was deliberate. Her pulse roared in her ears, her entire body locked in place as she stared at their hands. His larger, motionless for so long, now gripping hers with a strength that shouldn't have been possible. She wanted to tell herself it wasn't real, that she was imagining things again, but she wasn't. And then his eyes snapped open, A sharp gasp lodged in her throat. For months, she had cared for him, had memorized every detail of his face, had wondered what color his eyes were beneath those closed lids. Now she knew. Deep blue, darker than she had expected, sharper despite their haze of confusion. He blinked slowly, his gaze unfocused, searching. Then, his lips parted, a sound barely escaping. A rough, hoarse whisper, as if he hadn't used his voice in a lifetime. Anna. The world tilted. For a full second, she forgot how to move, how to breathe, how to process what had just happened. Then, as if snapped back into reality, her instincts kicked in. Her hand ripped away from his, trembling as she stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the basin of water in her rush to reach the emergency button. Her fingers slammed against it, sending a loud alarm blaring through the room. The door burst open seconds later. Doctors, nurses, Dr. Harris at the front of the team, his face a mask of urgency as they flooded the space around the bed. What happened? Dr. Harris demanded, already moving to check Grant's vitals. Anna's voice shook. He grabbed my hand. He opened his eyes. She turned back toward Grant, half expecting to find him unconscious again, as if it had all been some cruel trick of her imagination. But no, he was still awake. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his fingers still twitching faintly against the sheets, his body struggling to obey commands it hadn't been given in a year. And through it all, as the doctors surrounded him, speaking in rapid-fire medical terminology, his gaze kept searching for her. Then, as if sensing her watching, he found her again. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, Anna saw something there that hadn't existed before. Recognition, something deep, unspoken, fragile yet undeniable. She swallowed hard, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure the entire room could hear it. Because in that moment, she realized something terrifying, something impossible. He didn't just wake up. He knew her. Grant's recovery was slow, but every small victory felt monumental. The first few days after he woke up were a blur of tests, medical evaluations, and endless questions. His muscles had atrophied after a year of stillness, leaving him weak, exhausted after even the slightest movement. His voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper at first, but the real battle wasn't physical. It was the memories or lack of them. The doctors had explained it as post-traumatic amnesia, a common condition after severe head injuries. The brain, they said, had a way of protecting itself, of locking away the worst moments until it was ready to face them. He remembered his name. He remembered how to speak, how to think, how to move. But his past, his life before the accident, it was like looking into a fogged mirror, distorted, unclear, broken into pieces he couldn't put together. What's the last thing you remember? Dr. Harris had asked him during one of their early sessions. Grant had exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the bed sheets in frustration. He had been trying to remember for days, trying to force something, anything, back into his mind. I don't know, he admitted. There are flashes, feelings mostly. I remember. He hesitated, his brow furrowing. A road. Headlights. Something wrong. Anna, standing quietly in the corner, had stiffened. Can you remember where you were going? He shook his head. No, just that something felt off. It haunted him, that sensation of danger like a whisper just out of reach. And yet, no matter how much he strained, the answers wouldn't come. Anna saw the frustration in his eyes every time he tried and failed to piece together the past. So she stayed, more than just as his nurse, more than just as the person responsible for his recovery. She became his anchor. She was there during physical therapy, coaxing him to take one more step, then another. She was there late at night, when the memories refused to come, when the weight of everything threatened to suffocate him. She didn't just see him as a billionaire in recovery. She saw him. And maybe that was why, when he looked at her, he felt like he should know her, like she had always been there. And in a way, she had. But everything changed the night Anna discovered the truth. She had never been able to shake the feeling that something was wrong about his accident. The way his car had veered off a bridge in the middle of the night, the lack of a clear explanation. So, when she found herself unable to sleep, she did what she always did. She searched for answers. Sitting at her small desk in hospital archives, she sifted through Grant's medical records, police reports, insurance claims. And then she found it. A single line in the accident reconstruction report. Brake failure confirmed due to external tampering. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Not malfunction, not worn out parts. Tampered. Someone had wanted him dead. Her blood ran cold. She swallowed, forcing herself to keep reading, to absorb every detail. The police had found no evidence of a direct culprit. No fingerprints, no surveillance footage, nothing concrete enough to move forward. It had been brushed aside as an unsolved mystery. But Anna knew better. This wasn't just an accident. Someone had tried to kill Grant Carter. And whoever they were, they had gotten away with it. The next morning, she walked into his room, her fingers still trembling from the weight of what she had learned. Grant was sitting up for the first time without assistance, his hands resting in his lap, his body still weak but stronger than before. But when she looked at him, all she could see was the truth. Someone had wanted him gone, and they still might. Anna. His voice was still rough but steady now. He frowned, watching the way she hesitated in the doorway. What's wrong? She should have waited, should have let the doctors handle it. But this was his life, his past, his truth. So she stepped forward, taking a breath. I found something, she said carefully, about your accident. His body went rigid, tension creeping in his posture. What do you mean? She swallowed. It wasn't an accident, Grant. Someone tampered with your brakes. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, his entire expression shifted. Pain, confusion, and then something else. A flicker of recognition, like a door had been cracked open in his mind. A sharp breath left his lips, his fingers gripping the blanket as his gaze went distant, as if he were seeing something just beyond her. I remember. Anna's heart pounded. What do you remember? He closed his eyes, his brows furrowed, his breathing uneven. The road, it was raining. I was driving late at night. I was distracted. Then his jaw tightened. Headlights, bright, rushing toward me. Anna felt a chill run down her spine. Someone was there, he murmured, almost to himself. I saw them, right before the crash. She held her breath. "Who?" she whispered. Grant's eyes snapped open, and for the first time since waking up, fear flickered behind his gaze. I don't know, but Anna could tell. Somewhere deep in his subconscious, he did. And whoever it was, they weren't finished yet. Grant sat in the dimly lit hospital room, staring at the city skyline through the wide glass windows. His fingers tapped absently against the armrest of his wheelchair, his mind racing. The memory of that night had returned in fragments. The rain, the blinding headlights, the gut-wrenching realization that his brakes weren't working. But the face, the identity of the person responsible, remained just beyond reach, like a puzzle missing its final piece. Anna sat beside him, her laptop open on the small rolling table. She had been digging through financial records, old company transactions, anything that might lead them to the truth. Neither of them spoke, the tension between them thick with unspoken possibilities. Then she found it. Grant! She breathed, her voice tight. He turned, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. She hesitated, her pulse pounding, before turning the laptop toward him. The screen glowed in the dark room, illuminating a bank statement from a private account. An account that had wired a substantial amount of money to a known criminal, a man with a history of arranging staged accidents. The date of the transfer? 5 days before Grant crash. His throat went dry. Who sent it? His voice was quieter than she had expected. Anna swallowed hard. She had checked, double-checked, traced the transaction through every possible lead. The answer was undeniable. Her fingers hovered over the name on the screen. Then, she turned the laptop fully so he could see. One name, Nathan Carter. The room felt colder. Grant's breath left him in a slow, disbelieving exhale. He blinked, as if trying to force his mind to reject what was right in front of him. No, he muttered. That can't be right. Anna said nothing, because it was right. Nathan Carter, his own half-brother, the man who had grown up beside him, had stood next to him in family photos, had shared the Carter name, the same father, the same legacy. The man who had wanted him dead. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped Grant's lips, but there was no humor in it. Of course. Anna studied him, worried by the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers curled into fists. "Grant," she said gently, reaching out. He didn't react. His mind was racing, images flashing through his thoughts. Nathan's forced smiles over the years, the resentment he had tried to ignore, the subtle digs, the sharp words disguised as brotherly banter. Had always been there? Had his own brother been planning this all along? "I should have seen it," he muttered, shaking his head. "I should have known." Anna leaned forward. "This isn't your fault." He let out a slow breath, his gaze darkening. "No, but now that I know," his eyes lifted, locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. "I'm going to make sure he pays for it." The Carter estate was as grand and imposing as Grant remembered. A sprawling fortress of glass, steel, and wealth, perched high above the city, untouched by time or tragedy. But tonight, as the sleek black car rolled up the winding driveway, it felt different, colder, like it no longer belonged to him. Anna sat beside him, her presence grounding him in a way nothing else could. She could feel the tension radiating off of him, his fingers flexing against his knee, his jaw locked in barely restrained fury. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. Grant didn't answer right away. His gaze was fixed on the golden-lit windows ahead, where he knew Nathan was waiting. Finally, he exhaled. "I need to hear him say it." Anna nodded, understanding. Closure wasn't just about knowing the truth. It was about facing it. The moment they stepped inside, Nathan was already waiting in the study, lounging in their father's old leather chair like he belonged there. A crystal tumbler of whiskey dangled between his fingers, and when he saw Grant, his lips curled into a slow, mocking smirk. "Well," Nathan drawled, leaning back lazily. "The dead man walks." Grant didn't react, didn't flinch at the casual cruelty of it. He just stepped forward, every movement deliberate, controlled. "I'll make this simple," he said, his voice calm. "Did you do it?" Nathan's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it deepened. "Do what, exactly?" he said, feigning innocence. Grant's hands clenched into fists. "Did you try to kill me?" The room went still. Nathan exhaled through his nose, shaking his head with something that almost resembled amusement. "You always were the smart one, weren't you, Grant?" Silence. Then, with no hesitation, no remorse, he said the words that shattered any lingering doubt. "Yes." Anna sucked in a sharp breath. Grant didn't move. Nathan tilted his head, studying his brother as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience, a problem that had refused to disappear. "Do you have any idea what it was like?" Nathan continued, setting his drink down with a quiet clink. "Living in your shadow, watching you get everything, the company, the power, the legacy, while I was just waiting." Grant's expression didn't change, but Anna could see the muscle in his jaw twitch. "You had everything," Nathan went on, his voice growing harder, more bitter. "And I was sick of waiting for you to fall." He leaned forward now, resting his elbows on the desk. "So I pushed you." Anna saw it, the way Grant's entire body tensed, a storm brewing behind his unreadable gaze. But he didn't explode, didn't throw a punch, didn't let the rage consume him. Instead, he smiled. And that was when Nathan realized something was wrong. The front doors burst open, followed by heavy footsteps and sharp voices. Nathan's eyes widened. "What the hell?" Two uniformed officers strode in. "Nathan Carter," one of them said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs, "you're under arrest for attempted murder." Nathan shot to his feet, panic flashing across his face for the first time. "You set me up," he snarled at Grant. Grant tilted his head slightly. "No, Nathan." His voice was quiet, almost pitying. "You set yourself up." The officers moved in, grabbing Nathan's arms. He struggled at first, fury twisting his features, but it was useless. "This isn't over." Nathan spat as they dragged him toward the door. His voice was wild now, desperate. "You think you've won? You think you're safe?" Grant didn't answer, didn't even look at him. The only time his expression softened was when he turned to Anna. Because when everything else had fallen apart, she was the one who had helped him piece himself back together. And as Nathan Carter disappeared from his life forever, Grant knew one thing for certain. He never would have survived without her. The night air was warm, carrying the faint scent of roses and freshly cut grass. The private terrace of the Carter estate was bathed in the soft glow of candlelight, flickering against the sleek glass railing that overlooked the city skyline. In the distance, the world moved on. Cars weaved through streets, lights twinkled from towering skyscrapers. But here, in this moment, everything was still. Anna hesitated at the entrance, glancing around at the carefully set table. A pristine white cloth, fine china, a bottle of wine chilling in an elegant silver bucket. A centerpiece of deep red roses rested between two polished silver candlesticks, their flames swaying in the breeze. It was beautiful and entirely unexpected. She turned, finding Grant already watching her from where he stood by the railing. He looked different tonight, not in the way he dressed, though the dark button-down and open collar suited him well, but in the way he carried himself. Lighter, as if for the first time in a long time, he could finally breathe. Nathan was gone. The weight of betrayal, of uncertainty, had been lifted. And now, there was only this. Only them. "You did all this?" she asked, stepping forward. Grant gave her a small, knowing smile. "I had some help." She exhaled a soft laugh, shaking her head as she took her seat. "I don't know if I should be impressed or suspicious." "Both," he admitted, pouring her a glass of wine before taking his own seat across from her. For a while, they ate in comfortable silence, the sounds of the city distant, the glow of candlelight making everything feel a little more intimate, a little more unreal. But then Grant set down his fork, his fingers drumming lightly against the table as he leaned forward. His gaze was unreadable, but there was a weight to it, a quiet intensity that made Anna's pulse quicken. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice low. She arched a brow. "That's always dangerous." He smirked, shaking his head. But when he spoke again, the teasing edge was gone. "Do you know how many people walked away from me while I was in that coma?" Anna's smile faded. She knew. She had seen the empty visitor logs, the way the world had moved on without him, leaving him behind as nothing more than a memory. "I lost everything that night," he continued. "My life, my future, my past. Hell, I didn't even know who I was when I woke up." He exhaled, staring down at the table for a long moment before looking at her again. "But you didn't leave. You were there, day after day, when everyone else had given up." Her throat tightened. "You took care of me when I couldn't even open my eyes. You refused to let me disappear." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. "And I don't think I ever really told you what that meant to me." Anna swallowed hard, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Grant, but he wasn't finished. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His fingers were warm, steady, tracing slow, deliberate circles against her skin. "I had everything before," he murmured. "Money, power, control, and I thought that was enough." His gaze softened, darkened, as if he was looking at something, someone he had only just now realized was the most important thing of all. "But none of it meant anything without you." Anna's breath hitched. She had never expected this, never let herself hope for it. And yet, as she sat there, staring into the eyes of the man she had spent months fighting for, she realized this was real. "Grant," she whispered again, but this time there was no protest in her voice, just emotion, raw and overwhelming. His thumb brushed against her knuckles, his grip tightening ever so slightly. "I love you." The words crashed over her, soft yet unshakable, unyielding in their truth. She blinked, barely able to breathe, barely able to believe, because this wasn't a man who said things lightly. This wasn't a man who handed out feelings without careful thought, without meaning every single word. Her voice broke, a quiet, disbelieving laugh escaping her lips. "You love me." His lips quirked. "Is that so hard to believe?" Anna let out a slow, shaky breath, blinking rapidly as she fought against the warm rush of emotion building in her chest. "A little." "What?" She shook her head, letting out a quiet, watery laugh. Because you're Grant Carter. He smirked, tilting his head. And you're Anna Monroe, the woman who saved my life. She swallowed hard, staring at him, searching his face for something, for hesitation, for doubt. But there was none. Only certainty. Only him. A smile trembled on her lips, and she squeezed his hand, her heart racing as she finally whispered the only words that mattered. I love you too. Grant exhaled, his shoulders dropping as if he had been holding his breath for this moment, for her. Then, with slow, deliberate ease, he lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his lips warm against her skin. And Anna knew this was the moment everything changed. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the Carter Estate's rooftop terrace. The city stretched out below, its skyline bathed in hues of amber and rose, a breathtaking view of glass towers and endless lights. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, Grant only saw her. Anna stood at the edge of the terrace, the gentle breeze catching in her hair as she gazed out over the horizon. There was something about the way she took in the world, the way she savored each moment, that made him want to freeze time, to live in this space with her forever. For months now, he had known exactly what he wanted, and he wasn't waiting another second. It's beautiful up here, she murmured, her arms resting lightly against the railing. Not as beautiful as you, Grant said from behind her. She turned, rolling her eyes playfully. Smooth, Carter. Very smooth. But whatever teasing remark she had prepared died on her lips the moment she saw the look in his eyes. It was different tonight. Deeper. Certain. Anna's breath caught in her throat as Grant took a step closer, reaching for her hand, his fingers warm as they intertwined with hers. I've spent my whole life chasing things, he said, his voice quiet but steady. Power. Success. A name that people respected, feared, and for a long time, I thought that was enough. Anna swallowed, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. And then I lost everything. His thumb brushed absently over her knuckles, his gaze never leaving hers. When I woke up in that hospital, I didn't just wake up to a new life. I woke up to you, to the woman who fought for me, even when I couldn't fight for myself, to the only person who didn't walk away when the rest of the world did. Her eyes burned with unshed tears. Grant exhaled a slow breath, and then he did it. Right there, on the rooftop beneath the setting sun and the endless sky, he lowered himself to one knee. Anna gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth as she watched him pull a small velvet box from his pocket. You didn't just save my life, Anna, he whispered. You became my life. The box flipped open, revealing the most stunning diamond ring she had ever seen. An elegant, timeless design set in a delicate platinum band, sparkling in the last light of day. Her world tilted. She blinked rapidly, trying to force herself to breathe, trying to process the moment that was unfolding right before her. Anna Monroe, Grant said softly, will you marry me? For a moment, she couldn't speak, couldn't move. Then, her breath left her in a choked laugh, a sound caught between a sob and pure, unfiltered joy. She nodded, so quickly, so frantically that she barely got the words out before she was laughing through the tears that spilled down her cheeks. Yes. Grant let out a breath of relief, his own smile breaking through as he slid the ring onto her trembling finger. Anna barely gave him a chance to stand before she threw herself into his arms, her hands tangling in his shirt, her lips crashing against his in a kiss that said everything she couldn't put into words. Grant's arms wrapped around her, holding her against him, solid, unshakable, endless. And as the last traces of the sun dipped beyond the skyline, they stood there, two souls who had walked through fire, who had lost and found each other in the unlikeliest of places. Together, forever. The Carter estate had never looked more breathtaking. By daylight, it had always been a symbol of power and wealth, a fortress built on generations of success. But tonight, under a canopy of twinkling lights and the warm glow of candlelit lanterns, it was something else entirely. It was magic. The sprawling gardens had been transformed, lined with rows of pristine white roses, their fragrance mixing with the crisp evening air. Silk-draped arches framed the aisle, leading to a stunning altar set beneath a towering oak tree, its branches adorned with delicate strings of fairy lights. The sound of soft music carried on the breeze, mingling with the quiet hum of anticipation from the gathered guests. Anna stood at the entrance, fingers tightening around her bouquet as she took one steadying breath. This was it, her wedding day, a day she had never dared to dream of, not like this. Not this perfect, this unreal, this absolutely right. A hand touched her arm. Lisa, her maid of honor, eyes gleaming with excitement. Are you ready? Anna let out a breathless laugh, her heart pounding in her chest. More than ever. And then the music shifted. The first notes of the wedding march drifted through the air, and as the doors slowly opened, the world faded away. She stepped forward, one slow, deliberate step at a time, moving through the sea of familiar faces, friends, colleagues, people who had once only known her as a nurse in a quiet hospital wing. Now, they were here for her, but Anna barely saw them, because at the end of the aisle, there was only one person who mattered. Grant stood waiting, his dark suit tailored to perfection, his hands clasped in front of him. But it wasn't his impeccable attire that caught her breath. It was the way he was looking at her, as if she was the only thing in the world. His blue eyes, once filled with anger and distance, now held nothing but love, warmth, devotion. And in that moment, Anna knew. She had been walking toward him long before today. Since the very first time she stepped into his hospital room. Since the first night she spoke to him in the silence. Since the first time he opened his eyes and whispered her name. She had been walking toward this moment, toward him, toward forever. As she reached the altar, Grant reached for her hand, his fingers curling around hers. "Hi," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the music. Anna's lips curved. "Hi." The ceremony passed in a blur of quiet vows, promises spoken with certainty, with love that had already been tested and proven unbreakable. And when the officiant finally said the words, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," a cheer erupted, the sound of applause and laughter filling the night air. Grant cupped her face, his thumb brushing gently over her cheek before leaning in, capturing her lips in a kiss that wasn't just a promise. It was a forever. The reception was nothing short of a dream. Laughter, music, champagne flowing freely. Friends and family danced beneath the open sky, the entire estate alive with celebration. But to Anna, it all faded into the background the moment Grant pulled her into his arms for their first dance. The music slowed, a soft melody drifting through the cool night air as they swayed together, his hand warm against the small of her back, her head resting against his chest. "Did I ever tell you how stunning you look?" he murmured against her ear. She smiled, eyes fluttering closed. A few times, not enough. Her fingers curled into his jacket, holding him closer. For the rest of the night, they barely left each other's side. But it was later, long after the guests had toasted their happiness, after the last song had played, that the world truly fell away. Hand in hand, they walked through the moonlit gardens, the celebration now just a distant murmur behind them. The soft rustle of leaves, the quiet hum of the night, wrapped around them like a whisper. Anna tilted her head up to look at him, her heart swelling at the way the silver light highlighted the sharp angles of his face, the depth in his blue eyes. Grant stopped walking, turning to face her fully. He reached for her hands, bringing them up between them, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. "Before you," he said, voice barely above a whisper, filled with something deeper than words could capture. "I thought I had everything." Anna felt her chest tighten, emotion rising in her throat. His fingers traced slow circles against her skin, his gaze locked onto hers. "But now I know." His lips curved slightly, soft, reverent. "Nothing matters without you." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she smiled through it, her heart so full, so impossibly full. Because she understood. Because she had never felt more at home than she did in this moment, with him. Grant exhaled, shaking his head slightly as he pulled her in, resting his forehead against hers. Anna closed her eyes, breathing him in, knowing this was forever. Their story wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about waking up, about finding the truth, about justice or redemption. It was about love. Love that had been tested. Love that had endured. Love that had won. And so, their story came full circle. A story that began in a hospital room, filled with silence and uncertainty, now ended in a garden bathed in moonlight and love. A story that had once been about loss, betrayal, and the edge of death had become one of hope, healing, and a love stronger than fate itself. Grant Carter, the man who had once thought himself untouchable, who had spent his life chasing power and success, had nearly lost everything. But in that loss, he had found something greater than any empire he had ever built. Anna Monroe, the nurse who had once believed she was just one person in a world too big, too chaotic, had become the one thing that held them together when everything else had fallen apart. Their love hadn't come easily. It had been tested in the deepest of waters, forged through pain and perseverance, through moments of doubt and quiet, unspoken devotion. But in the end, it had survived. Because love isn't just about finding someone. It's about standing beside them when the world turns dark, when hope seems lost, when fate pushes you to the brink and demands to know if you will fight for it. Anna had fought for Grant long before he even knew she existed. And now, he would spend forever fighting for her. As they stood there, lost in each other's arms, the world faded around them. The past, the pain, the betrayal, the shadows of what could have been, was just that, the past. What mattered now was this moment. What mattered was forever. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more emotional and inspiring tales. Because sometimes, the most beautiful love stories don't begin with grand gestures or perfect moments. Sometimes, they begin in the quiet, in the unexpected, in the spaces between hope and heartbreak. And sometimes, love doesn't just find you. It saves you. See you in the next story.